touring Iceland by car in the summertime. From Reykjavík we drove to the Snæfellsnes Peninsula and then caught the Ferry Baldur to the Westfjords Peninsula. We drove around the Westfjord Peninsula, stopping at the Rauðisandur Beach, the seabird cliffs at Látrabjarg, and then Drangsnes before returning to Reykjavík. At Reykjavík we headed east on the Golden Circle to Þingvellir, Geysir, and the falls at Gullfoss before heading southeast to Vík. We continued east to the Jökulsárlón glacier lagoon and then looped back west to Mývatn lake before heading north to the Dettifoss falls and hence to Húsavík for some whale watching. From Húsavík we drove west past the Goðafoss waterfall to the Grettislaug hot pool before returning to Reykjavík to pick up a 4x4 vehicle for a visit to the interior region. From Reykjavík we drove to Landmannalaugar and then returned to Reykjavík, taking a side trip to the lonely DC-3 plane crash site near Vík. In Reykjavík we picked up our mini camper van and then headed northwest through farmland to the Snæfellsnes Peninsula. We watched a pretty scene of a ship sailing down a fjord, except that the ship was an Icelandic whaler, off to kill whales. It is incongruous that Iceland sells whale watching trips, yet kills whales as well. On our way to the Snæfellsnes Peninsula, we stopped on the long causeway at Borgarnes for a picnic lunch. It was impressive to see the hardy tourists on their bicycles as they pedaled around Iceland despite the wind, rain, and hilly terrain. Along the south shore of the Snæfellsnes Peninsula, we passed by scenes of pastures and farms, with the ever-present background of mountains on our right and the ocean on our left. Several of the farms had a beautiful waterfall as a backdrop. Especially attractive was the Bjarnarfoss waterfall. Mount Snæfell is omnipresent on the Snæfellsnes Peninsula. Baldur's Church is a church that has been rebuilt many times over the centuries. Its lovely setting and color makes it very photogenic. Near the town of Arnarstapi are coastal cliffs with impressive volcanic columns and plenty of seabirds flying about. Mount Snæfell dominates the Snæfellsnes Peninsula, and it is frequently visible, especially on the south shore. The mountain is a stratovolcano with a glacier covering its summit. It is famous due to Jules Verne's 1864 novel entitled Journey to the Center of the Earth, in which the protagonists find the entrance on the mountain to a passage leading to the center of the Earth. The west side of Mount Snæfell is the most interesting, given the riot of lava flows on the west flank. Grundarfjörður is a small town with an interesting and busy harbor. Surprisingly, in the harbor, the luxury ship Le Boreal was just departing. I had seen this elegant ship 18 months before in Ushuaia, Argentina, when it was departing that harbor for a trip to Antarctica. Berserkjaroen is a moss-covered lava field with pieces of lava thrust this way and that into fantastic shapes. We followed the dirt road through the lava field, and even though it was 9 p.m., we still had enough light to get a good view. Finally, just before 10 p.m., we reached Stakesholmer, and after a short drive around town, we set up our small but comfortable camper for the night at the local campgrounds. Our mini camper had a stove, mini fridge, heater, sink, and bench that folded down into a comfortable bed once our luggage was moved onto the front seats. In the morning we packed up and drove to the harbor in Stakesholmer to catch the Ferry Baldur to the Westfjords. It was very windy during our ferry crossing of Beta Fjordur, which made taking steady photographs a challenge. The island of Flatey lies in the middle of Beta Fjordur. It is some 2 kilometers long and about 1 kilometer wide. It is mainly flat, hence its name Flatey means flat island. We stopped briefly to let off tourists as the island is very popular in the summer season, but in the winter the island's population is only about 5 people. Most of the tourists stay in the old village, which consists of some beautifully restored and painted houses of the island's original inhabitants. From the ferry we drove to the Látrabjarg sea cliffs with a side trip to the Rauðisandur Beach. The ship BA-64 was built in 1912 in Norway and served as a whaler and then a fishing boat before it was abandoned on the beach in 1981, where it rusts away. We drove down the narrow road around some very tight hairpin turns towards Rauðisandur Beach. Rauðisandur Beach is a 10-kilometer long red sand beach that on a sunny day is well worth a visit. Since the roads in the Westfjord are narrow, oncoming vehicles have to get over, but not everyone feels this requirement applies to them, unfortunately. From Rauðisandur, we could see the sea cliffs at Látrabjarg covered by a blanket of clouds, so we knew that the conditions there were not ideal for our visit. Back on the coastal road to Látrabjarg, the view was very pretty in the sunshine, but the winds were high, which made standing still to take a picture impossible. The white whooper swans with their yellow beaks were always worth stopping to see. The clouds on the highlands in the distance where we were heading were a cause for concern. Along the coast was an interesting local museum with an eclectic collection, including an old U.S. Navy variant of the DC-3, fishing boats, and a beautiful metallic sculpture with a cross. From the coast we climbed up to the highlands and entered the clouds. Despite the clouds, we made good time as we encountered sunny patches and few vehicles. Finally we arrived at Látrabjarg, but the winds were very high, with gusts up to 50 miles an hour, making it both cold and dangerous to get near the edge of the cliffs to better see the seabirds. Látrabjarg is the westernmost part of Iceland. This seabird cliff is 14 kilometers long and up to 440 meters high. It is home to millions of birds, including puffins, northern gannets, guillemots, and razorbills. The puffins had no fear of us, so we could see them up close, while the other seabirds, such as gulls and guillemots, were not as approachable. Apart from the seabirds, we could see an Icelandic Coast Guard ship struggling against the wind along the coast, which reminded us that Látrabjarg is located on the Denmark Strait, where in the Second World War HMS Hood was sunk by the German battleship Bismarck in 1941. Finally, it was time to leave Látrabjarg with its high winds and drive to our campsite for the night at Reykjafjordur. The drive to Reykjafjordur retraced part of a route to Látrabjarg and then passed by many new scenic views. When we arrived at Reykjafjordur, there were several other campers there, but crowded it wasn't. After supper we took a relaxing dip in the hot pool and watched a magnificent sunset at 10:45 p.m. before turning in for the night. In the morning we drove on to Drangsnes and its hot tubs on the seashore. The first part of the drive to Drangsnes involves a lot of steep ascents and descents as one crosses the mountain spines between fjords until Ísafjörður. We drove right by the top of Dettifoss and then descended down to the fjord where we could see the complete 100-meter drop of these falls. Near Þingvellir, we watched farmers making giant bales of hay that dot much of the landscape like giant marshmallows. Approaching Ísafjörður, we passed through an interesting tunnel that had a Y split in it deep inside the mountain. The right branch of the Y took us to Ísafjörður. The cruise ship MS Astor was in port, and its passengers were wandering about the town. Ísafjörður is a town of about 2,600 people. Fishing has been the town's main industry, but there has been a decline in the fishing industry in recent times. The town center has a number of interesting old buildings. Leaving Ísafjörður, we started driving up and down a series of fjords. It was like driving along the outline of the fingers of your hand. That is to say, it took a long time to get anywhere. Along our route, we encountered a series of interesting scenes that helped break up the monotony of driving down one side of a fjord, then turning about and driving back up the other side. We stopped to see a colony of seals, which was surprisingly enough our only good view of seals in Iceland. Unfortunately, the seals were lethargic and only rolled about on their corpulent bodies. Sheep darting onto the roadway are an ever-present danger whilst driving about Iceland. We stopped by an abandoned fishing village to gaze at a waterfall across the Ísafjörður fjord. Finally, we arrived at Drangsnes and relaxed in the oceanside hot tubs where we had an interesting discussion with some locals before heading to the campsite for the night. In the morning we departed Drangsnes and drove back to Reykjavík to get our camper either fixed or replaced. For part of the drive, Mount Snæfell was omnipresent. Back in Reykjavík, we exchanged our camper for a new red one and then headed out to drive part of the Golden Circle tour route. Our first stop was at Þingvellir, where the Icelandic Parliament was established in 930 AD and met there until 1798. It is also the site of a rift valley that marks a crest in the mid-Atlantic ridge which separates the Eurasian tectonic plate from the North American plate. Scuba divers dive in the silver crack between the continents where the visibility is superb. Gullfoss is one of the most popular tourist attractions in Iceland. It is the two-step waterfall, with the first step being 11 meters high and the second step being 21 meters high. The size of the falls is apparent when looking at the people standing near it. From Gullfoss we drove back to Geysir to see the frequently erupting Geyser. While Geysir itself rarely erupts, Stókur erupts several times an hour, often several times at each go. However, the heights of the eruptions varies widely, from a few meters to up to 30 meters. It was fascinating to watch the boiling water rise up in the vent and then erupt high into the air. After the eruption, the water drained back into the vent, and so the cycle began again. We watched Stókur erupting several times and then set up camp nearby where we could see and hear the geyser erupting. In the morning during breakfast, we watched Stókur erupting and an Arctic fox trotting past. Being able to camp near the geyser was one of the many times that having a camper van paid off for us on this trip. From Geysir we made the long drive to Skaftafell National Park. The drive was a long one due to the many stops that we made along the route due to the beautiful scenery and things to see. Our first stop was at Seljalandsfoss. It is one of the most famous waterfalls in Iceland with a height of about 60 meters. An attraction of this waterfall is that it is possible to walk behind the waterfall without becoming soaking wet. Skógafoss is one of the biggest waterfalls in the country, with a width of 25 meters and a drop of 60 meters. The people who had hiked up to the overlook at the top of Skógafoss looked very small indeed. Solheimajokull is one of the several very approachable glaciers where glacier walks are offered. We stopped to see an amazing building that is built under a cliff such that the overhanging cliff is incorporated into the roof itself. Dyrhólaey is a small peninsula with high cliffs where puffins nest. The burrows dug by puffins for use as their nests were visible. From the top of the cliffs we could look down on the scene of puffins coming and going. While Arctic terns dive bomb into the water to catch their food, the puffins swim on the surface and then dive down and swim underwater to catch their favorite food, the sand eel. They catch multiple sand eels before they return to their nests to feed their young. The top of the cliff affords excellent views whether looking south to the sea arch, or west to the Rauðisandur Beach, or east to the sea stacks of Reynisdrangar. After lunch we made the short drive to the black sand beach at the sea stacks of Reynisdrangar. More interesting than the sea stacks themselves was the foot of the mountain covered with basalt columns. These columns are readily climbable. We continued east past Vik along a beautiful stretch of the ring road. The intrepid bike tourists never cease to impress us with their hardiness. Nearing Skaftafell National Park, the scene is dominated by a series of impressive glaciers. The twisted remains of the Ring Road Highway Bridge destroyed by ice in a flood in 1996 were impressive. The campsite at Skaftafell National Park is sited beside the foot of a glacier. The sign in the campsite shower advised us that no clothes are worn in the shower, an instruction that we took to heart. In the early morning, we hiked up to see the iconic Þingvellir waterfall. With an early start, there was no one at the falls, which made the visit a little better. Þingvellir is a 20-meter high waterfall that falls down into an amphitheater of dark basalt columns, making it somewhat unique. Leaving the campsite in Skaftafell National Park, we made the short drive to Thrihnukagigur glacier and then walked up beside the glacier to survey it. We could see tourists out on a glacier walk. The people on the glacier walk looked very small indeed. The lake at the foot of the glacier is fed by the runoff from the glacier. Leaving Thrihnukagigur, we drove towards Jökulsárlón glacial lagoon. Jökulsárlón is a glacial lagoon located right by the ring road that has huge blocks of glacial ice floating in it. The amazing Jökulsárlón has been the setting for 4 Hollywood movies, including 2 James Bond movies, A View to a Kill and Die Another Day. The lagoon was a sea of activity given the Arctic terns feeding, the seals patrolling, the ice drifting, and the tour boats moving about. There were several amphibians ferrying tourists about the lagoon. The amphibians are Vietnam-era vehicles that efficiently move large numbers of tourists as they are fast-loading and take no time to enter or to exit the water. While waiting for our Zodiac departure time, we watched the amphibians swimming about, each one being followed by a Zodiac acting as its safety boat. In lieu of an amphibian, we took the more expensive and longer-lasting Zodiac tour of the lagoon. The color of the ice blocks floating on the lagoon varied widely, from white to deep aquamarine to black, caused by volcanic ash that had fallen on the glacier from a volcanic eruption. We approached the impressive face of the Jökulsárlón glacier, which is the source of the ice blocks on the lagoon. The surface of the glacier is covered by volcanic ash from the 2010 eruption of the nearby volcano. This was the eruption that disrupted transatlantic and European flights for several weeks. Returning from our Zodiac trip, we decided to stay the night in our camper beside the outlet of the lagoon, where a fast-flowing tidal current was carrying ice blocks out of the lagoon and into the ocean. The sun setting over the lagoon was impressive, with ice blocks drifting around, Arctic terns swirling about, and even a seal on the scene for good measure. After sunset, the action in the outlet picked up as the powerful current pulled out a succession of ice blocks, some of which became grounded and then were hit by other ice blocks in turn. It was quite entertaining to watch. Eventually the ice blocks reached the ocean, where they were caught up in the surf. Finally we turned in for the night, but through the windshield of our camper we could see the ice blocks being pulled out of the lagoon. In the morning after breakfast we continued our road trip counterclockwise around the eastern part of Iceland to Mývatn Lake in the north. The drive along the coast from Jökulsárlón to Hup is very scenic, with abandoned farm buildings and glaciers appearing in a verdant countryside. Continuing east of Hup, fjords are encountered, some of which have fish farms in them. Gerstadakirkja is a reconstruction of an early Norse Christian chapel from the 10th century. It was built following traditional Icelandic building methods using a wood frame and thick walls of sod. Nearing Mývatn, we stopped to see the Krafla geothermal power station, which is Iceland's largest geothermal power station. The steam to drive its turbines is produced by the natural subsurface heating. Nearby Krafla is Námaferkla geothermal area, which gets its name of Mountain of the Mine from the sulfur mining that used to be practiced there. The area contains fumaroles, mud pots, and steam vents. Unlike many of the similar geothermal features in Yellowstone National Park, those at Námaferkla can be walked right up next to. The mud in the area is very sticky and difficult to remove, even with toilet paper. We camped at Reykjavík beside some regular-sized camper vehicles that dwarfed our little camper van. In the morning we headed out in the incessant rain to explore the area around Mývatn Lake. At Kálfarströnd there are mushroom-like lava columns in a cove on Mývatn Lake. It was entertaining to watch the young eider ducks duck diving down into the lake and popping back up to the surface. After a short pleasant hike we arrived at the lava columns whose size can be seen given the people standing near them. Dimmuborgis, meaning dark castle, is a large lava field containing unusual shapes. The area includes various volcanic caves, tunnels, and rock formations reminiscent of an ancient collapsed black citadel, hence the name. In Nordic Christian lore, Dimmuborgis is a place where Satan landed when he was cast out from heaven and created the catacombs of hell. Kirkjan, or church, is a fascinating lava tube. The Skutistelager pseudocraters were formed when lava flowing above the ground heated subsurface water, causing explosions from the steam and gas buildup. Pseudocraters are also found on Mars. After a cold day of hiking in the rain, it was time to visit the hot water lagoon of the Mývatn Natural Baths. We found the Mývatn Natural Baths better than their much more famous cousin, the Blue Lagoon near Reykjavík. It was interesting to see the in-water massage service in action. We left the baths in the early evening and then made the drive to Dettifoss to spend the night. After a couple of hours of driving, we arrived at Dettifoss and found that we were the only people there. The falls were impressive in the twilight. In the morning it was time to hike down to see Dettifoss up close in the daylight. In the distance behind Dettifoss we could see Selfoss. Dettifoss is 45 meters high and it is the largest waterfall in Europe in terms of the volume of water flowing over it. However, it does not come even close to Niagara Falls either in terms of height or flow volume. However, it is very impressive in its isolated setting. Leaving Dettifoss, we hiked about 2 kilometers upstream to the Selfoss waterfall. The hike was through a rough boulder field that rose and fell alongside the river. Arriving at the Selfoss waterfall, we could see the broad front of the waterfall and the horseshoe portion of the falls where most of the water flowed over. The falls themselves are about 11 meters high. Hiking back from Selfoss, we arrived at the parking lot, which was now full of cars. It was time to go. Leaving Dettifoss, we drove northwest towards Húsavík on the coast, with 2 stops planned along the way. Our first stop was to see the horseshoe-shaped Ásbyrgi Canyon. The people standing on the prow of the rock island in the center of the canyon showed its 100-meter height. Our second stop was to be Hljóðaklettar, but to get there we had to drive down a dirt road full of potholes. After lunch we were ready to hike around Hljóðaklettar. Hljóðaklettar in the canyon of the Jökulsárlón River is a distinctive cluster of rock formations formed by a mass of basalt columns. The columns lie at all angles, and the riot of shapes formed by them is like nothing we had seen before. The innumerable basalt columns were bent at various angles and curvatures, forming fantastic shapes that left everything to the imagination. When it was time to leave, we were very happy to have made the rough drive to Hljóðaklettar. The drive along the coast road to Húsavík afforded us wonderful views of the coastline. The campsite at Húsavík was set on the grassy side of a hill. In the morning we loaded up and drove into town to catch a whale-watching trip out into Skafandi Bay. At 8 in the morning we packed onto the beautiful old wooden fishing boat named the Nafari for our whale-watching trip. Out on Skafandi Bay we wallowed in heavy swells while waiting for something to see. At last our patience was rewarded as some white-beaked dolphins passed by us. Finally a humpback whale surfaced near us and we got a good view of his tail fluke as he dived. The whale sightings were not as good as we had hoped for, and we could not help wondering if the whale hunting boats that we had seen earlier in the south of Iceland were having an effect on the sightings. With the whale watching over, we had lunch near the Húsavík church, which was built in 1907 from wood imported from Norway. Lunch over, we drove off towards Grettislaug. We stopped to see Goðafoss, meaning the waterfall of the gods, since this is where the statues of the Norse gods were thrown into the river in 1000 AD when Christianity was adopted in Iceland. The falls of the Skálfjandafjord River are about 30 meters wide and drop 12 meters. At Akureyri, we drove south past the interesting airport with its Iceland Air DC-3 to see the Grundarkirkja church in its pastoral setting. The beautiful Grundarkirkja was built by a farmer in 1905. Back in Akureyri, we stopped to see the impressive Akureyri church with its distinctive and appealing Art Deco twin spires. It was completed in 1940 and dominates the city from its hilltop location. The Glimpesh farmstead has a number of sod farm buildings dating from the 18th and 19th centuries. After about 1900, this style of construction was gradually replaced by reinforced concrete. The turf roof must be sloped at the correct angle, since if it is too flat, water leaks through, and if it is too steep, the turf cracks during spells of dry weather or drains too quickly such that the grass does not grow. In both cases, the result is a roof that leaks. A number of families from the Glimpesh area emigrated to Gimli, Manitoba for a better life in Canada in the 1880s. We arrived at the Grettislaug campsite at about 8 o'clock and had supper and then proceeded for a relaxing dip in the hot pool. The water was so hot in the pool that the cold water hose proved useful to keep from being cooked in the pool like lobsters. In the morning we made the long drive back to Reykjavík to drop off our camper van and pick up a 4x4. The impressive Blundos church was built to resemble a volcano. The stone people were happy to see us. The new mural on a farm building called the Battle for Hljóðaklettar was an interesting sight. We camped overnight in Reykjavík and then picked up our 4x4 in the morning. The route to Landmannalaugar in the interior of Iceland and back to Reykjavík passed over routes that legally required the use of 4x4s due to their rough nature and the requirement to ford rivers. While our 4x4 would get us where we wanted to go, unfortunately we'd have to sleep in the seat since we had no tent with us. Finally, we encountered the first road that legally required the use of 4x4s. However, this did not stop one tourist from driving their mini rental car over the road and risking legal problems with their rental company. Arriving at Landmannalaugar, we encountered the first of two fords to actually get to the campsite. As we had no experience fording civilian vehicles, we stopped and watched several vehicles fording to see where to cross. We even got to watch a herd of horses fording the river before we crossed. Finally, it was go time for us, and as we forded, the chatty GPS tried to be helpful.
Recalculating. Drive 900 meters, then turn right.
Success, John. The campsite at Landmannalaugar was very busy, but for us we just set up in the parking lot since we'd be sleeping in our car. Landmannalaugar is famous for its multicolored rhyolite hills. Rhyolite is a volcanic rock that displays a wide spectrum of colors including pink, brown, green, yellow, purple, blue, black, and white. We hiked up the hill overlooking Landmannalaugar and then continued up to Brennisteinssletta to see the geothermal features on that mountain. It was a rather dreary day with drizzle falling from an overcast sky. Finally we reached the colorful scene at the Brennisteinssletta volcano with greens from mosses, blacks from lava and ashes, reds from iron in the earth, and smoke rising from steam vents on the side of the mountain. However, the scene would have been much more colorful in direct sunlight. Returning to Landmannalaugar, we put on our bathing suits and made the cool walk on the boardwalk to the natural hot pool and its relaxing waters. Back at the car, we bedded down on the seats for the night. In the early morning, we drove off on the return route to Reykjavík via Vík, a route that would take us across 22 fords. The sign was very clear that the route F208 required a 4x4 to cross the river fords. Route F208 passed through very picturesque country that made the drive a special one, especially with the regular requirement to ford the streams along the way. We only saw one other vehicle going our way on our trip out. At each ford we stopped to decide on the best route to cross, and once across we decremented our count of fords remaining from the grand total of 22.
Well, that was a little deeper than expected.
Fording always raised the level of excitement in the vehicle. The regular green on the hillside was interspersed with patches of electric green moss that looked unreal. Apart from passing hikers and sheep, we also passed by a bus taking day trippers to Landmannalaugar. We were lucky to avoid running over a sheep that darted out in front of us.
Watch this one.
Finally, we arrived back at Vík and watched the locals parasailing over the cliffs before buying an Icelandic sweater. Next, we set our sights on the wreckage of a U.S. Navy DC-3 that crash-landed years ago. The trick was to find it. West of Vik, we turned off the ring road onto Sólheimasandur Beach and started looking for an old DC-3 crash site. The black sand beach is huge, but finally we saw the outline of the DC-3 wreck in the distance. In 1972, this U.S. Navy DC-3 ran low on fuel and made an emergency landing on Sólheimasandur Beach. All on board survived the landing, but it was deemed too expensive to salvage the entire plane, so it was stripped of valuable parts and the carcass left on the beach to rot. After 41 years on the beach, the remaining wreckage is rotten and climbing into the cockpit requires great care. Offshore in the distance, a trawler battling forward against heavy seas provided an interesting backdrop for the plane wreckage. As we were the only ones at the crash site, there was endless opportunity to explore the wreckage, but it was time to return to Reykjavík. The astonishing Hallgrímskirkja dominates the skyline of Reykjavík. From Reykjavík, it is but a short drive to the jumping-off point for the hike to the Thrihnukagigur volcano. The walk to the volcano is moderately difficult due to the very rocky, ankle-bending terrain that must be traversed. We walked across a small bridge spanning the Eurasian and North American tectonic plates. While gearing up to enter the volcano, we watched an orphan young Arctic fox playing with a guide. The Thrihnukagigur volcano has been dormant for over 4,000 years, but surprisingly its last eruption left behind a huge empty magma chamber. The chamber is bottle shaped and 120 meters deep. It is one of the few magma chambers that can be descended into. The 120-meter descent down into the magma chamber is via a window washer type elevator. At the top, the opening is narrow, so one passes close by the walls. Once at the bottom, we move quickly out of the drop zone where water is falling like rain. The walls of the magma chamber include a surprising number of colors in the rock matrix, including purples, reds, and blacks laid out in a variety of patterns. We had about 35 minutes to explore around the bottom of the chamber. We watched the elevator descend to pick us up and take us back up the 120 meters to the surface. Once aboard the elevator, it was a 10-minute lift to the surface. Once at the top, we could look out over Reykjavík in the distance and then have a nice bowl of hot Icelandic meat soup before stumbling back across the rock-strewn volcanic field to the parking lot. From Reykjavík, we drove to the Blue Lagoon via the coastal town of Grindavik. The wind was very high, but the gnomes were safe in their rock house. The geothermal plant near the Blue Lagoon had a very James Bond evil villain's lair feel about it. As we arrived at the Blue Lagoon late in the evening, there were few people there. We slathered on the silica mud to benefit from its purported medicinal power. The bottom of the lagoon was uneven, making it hazardous to walk around on. Overall, we found the Blue Lagoon very overhyped and not worth the cost. The Solfar, meaning Sun Voyager, is an iconic sculpture installed in 1990. It represents a dreamboat. We walked up the hill to the astonishing Hallgrímskirkja that dominates the skyline of Reykjavík. This Church of Iceland church does not disappoint even when seen up close. The 75-meter spire has an observation deck. In front of the church is a statue of Leif Erikson, a son of Iceland who visited North America in 1000 AD. Hljóðaklettar is the main shopping street, and apart from shops, the stretch is lined with a variety of restaurants. Downtown Reykjavík contains interesting sights that we stumbled across whilst walking about. Graffiti Park is an area of buildings whose sides are covered with over-the-top paintings and not the usual poorly conceived and executed graffiti vandalism. Harpa is a new concert hall and conference center beside the harbor in the heart of Reykjavík. It opened in 2011. The view of Hallgrímskirkja up Skógafoss Street is very impressive. At sunset, the view along the shore in Reykjavík was quite beautiful as the sun's setting rays struck the Solfar sculpture and the Harpa concert hall. The windows of the Harpa are meant to be reminiscent of the crystallized basalt columns commonly found in Iceland. They create a kaleidoscope of reflections of the surrounding cityscape. Gay Pride Day in Reykjavík is a very important day. After 2 weeks in Iceland, it was time to take the 2 return flights required to return home. At noon, we headed out to the Keflavik airport for the first of our 2 flights back home. At the airport, we got our tax refund for purchases made and then boarded our plane. Flying over Greenland, we looked down on its glaciers. We passed over a huge wind farm in Quebec. Arriving in Boston, we had a long wait to get through U.S. immigration and then had to run to another terminal with our checked and cabin baggage to catch our final flight home. Transiting through the U.S. is something to be avoided if possible.
Take me somewhere nice, to some tired island in your heart called paradise.